West Cuba's Hidden Genocide, Deep Dive Anti-Communism, Fascism in Indonesia, and Western Imperialism. History of this conflict. West Cuba was originally populated by the Malaysian people some tens and thousands of years ago. After a little contact with the modern-day world, it was finally formed. Colonized by the Netherlands in 1898, the islands that now make up Indonesia were also colonized by the Dutch at that time, but when the Republic of Indonesia became an independent nation-state in 1949, West Papua did not join the country. The Dutch government recognized that West Papua was geographically, ethnically, and culturally different than Indonesia, and so the Dutch government began preparing and processing West Papua for its own independence through the 1950s, and at the end of 1961, West Papua held a congress at which its people declared independence and raised their new flag, the Morning Star. However, within months of this, the dream was crushed and dead. The Indonesian government wanted all the former Dutch colonies in the Asian Pacific region, and the Indonesian military soon invaded West Papua. Conflict broke out between the Netherlands, Indonesia, and the indigenous population regarding control of their territory. Unable to make a secure enough support for its invasion of West Papua, the fascist Indonesian government, let me remind you that they are very anti-communist, Indonesia is, and they're also pro-imperialism, aka fascist regime. The hammer and sickle has become systematized in the country, which itself is very similar to how Nazi symbolism is treated in the West in general. As such, displaying anything that is like pro-communism symbols in public, even without any political intentions, is still regarded as highly offensive to the government of Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the first countries in the world to ban communist symbols as a whole. In April 2017, Indonesian police detained a Malaysian tourist at a hotel for wearing a t-shirt with an image of the hammer and sickle symbol, which is a communist symbol. The tourist was not aware that communist symbols were banned in Indonesia. The police seized the t-shirt and released the tourist after giving him a warning. In May 2018, a Russian tourist was also detained by police in Bali for displaying a Soviet Victor banner, which also contains the communist symbol. Indonesia turned to the Soviet Union for help. It was at the height of the Cold War, and the United States government was worried that Indonesia was seeking support from the Soviet Union might increase and spread communism in Asia and the southeast of Asia. We all know what happened to the people in Indonesia who were communists. The United States did a coup of the country and murdered, hundreds of thousands of pro-communist supporters. And nowadays, Indonesia is just a fascist regime with just full-on pure fascism. Just take one good look and do some research and you'll find that out. Indonesia has probably the strictest anti-communism policies and communism phobia in, the modern day world. By 1969, there was widespread resistance to Indonesian rule. The Indonesian fascist couped military had killed and imprisoned thousands of indigenous people, pupils, and also any pro-communists in the 7 years it occupied the country. Yet it was under these conditions that the people were supposed to exercise their right to self-determination. It was agreed that the UN should oversee a plebiscite of the people of West Papua, in which they were given two choices: to remain part of Indonesia or to become an independent nation on its own. This vote was to be called an act of free choice. However, it was a fraud and a sham. Instead of overseeing a free and fair democratically election, the UN stood by like the Western imperialists they are. While fascist anti-communist regime in Indonesia rigged the voting system. People under fascism, there's a lot of corruption and censorship, declaring that the pupils were too primitive, aka racist rhetoric, to cope with democracy. The Indonesian military handpicked just over 1,000 representative people out of a population of 1 million, bribed them, and threatened to kill them and all their families if they voted the wrong way, aka pure fascism. So strong was the intimidation that despite widespread opposition to Indonesian rule. All 1,000 people voted to remain part of Indonesia because they were threatened with their life. Despite protests from the indigenous Papuans, a critical report by the UN official and the condemnation of the vote in international media, the UN shamefully sanctioned the result of West Papua has remained under control of the fascist Indonesian state ever since. Co-signing the fate of 1 million people to live under the brutal occupation and fascist regime that ensured is one of the most shameful chapters in the history of the UN. But this is just all typical act by Western colonizer imperialists, resistant to the Indonesian colonialism. Resistance to the Indonesian fascist occupation started from the first days after the invasion. An armed guerrilla movement called the DPM Free Papua movement was formed in 1970 to resist the colonization and fascism that is happening in West Papua. The OPM carried out a number of guerrilla attacks on the Indonesian military and the holdings of multinational companies who have taken Papuan land and resources, aka pure capitalism. Capitalism just loots and loots and loots. Just once again, capitalism puts profits over lives of everyone, the lives of Mother Earth, people, animals, etc., including a successful attempt to close down a Freeport gold and copper mine in the area. Armed mostly with bows and arrows, the small, ragged, but determined OPM fought an almost unknown war against the well-armed, Western-backed, fascist Indonesian military for decades. Now on to the present-day history events of the whole West Papua situation, the genocide. Since the first days of the Indonesian fascist occupation, the indigenous people of the land in West Papua have been under relentless attack by pro-capitalist, fascists, and imperialists in an attempt to control the indigenous population and to claim the land to make way for resource extraction, aka capitalism. The Indonesian fascist army has systematically murdered, raped, and tortured people in numbers that could constitute a genocide. One of the worst examples of this is the displacement and killing of thousands of people to make way for the giant American and British-owned Freeport mine, the largest gold mine in the world, which has reduced a sacred mountain to a crater and poisoned the local water supply river system. In a further attempt to eradicate indigenous culture in that area, around 1 million people from overcrowded, shouty towns across Indonesia have been moved into these concentration-like camps cut into the forests. Killed like animals, documents reveal how Australia turned a blind eye to the genocide in a West Papuan massacre. Typical colonizers as usual, typical capitalists, typical U.S. imperialists. Dozens of West Papuans were tortured and thrown into the sea 23 years ago, left to die. Days later, Australia knew the details of the attack, yet remained silent on the whole entire issue and the ongoing genocide that is happening. This is not surprising because Australia has a known history of racism and police brutality, genocides of their own Aboriginal Indigenous population of Australia. Many young students gathered had joined hundreds of other independent activists to fly the Morning Star, the banned West Papuan flag, near the harbor. And the roar of the Indonesian military helicopter overhead, they began raining bullets down on the protesters, like the typical fascist regime that they are. Corwana, one of the victims' skull was cracked from the butt of an Indonesian soldier's rifle, and his stomach was bleeding heavily from a machete wound as well. One thought sustained him: he had to live so that he could tell the story in the world what had happened on, where they were on July 6, 1998. In the 23 years since, not one person has been charged with the killings and the genocide. The massacre is not recognized officially, and no government or international inquiry has ever reported on it because all these countries are working together to target places to loot and spread anti-communism campaigns. The Indonesian government has straight up denied that this is happening. When bodies began washing up on the beaches, many mutilated horrifically, the Indonesian military and the Indonesian government themselves blamed a tsunami for the Papua New Guinea, more than 1,000 miles away, when Australia has only ever offered a muted response, expressing concern to the Indonesian government but not condemning the massacre or doing anything whatsoever.